Hare Krishna. Good morning, dear devotees. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Can I be heard? You can hear me? Yes? Okay, thank you. So today we have been and will continue to observe Srila Prabhupada's Disappearance Day. I say we have been because I spent several hours this morning reading TKG's diary. And although I'm really not going to speak much about what I read there, although it was definitely sobering. It was intended as a meditation in preparation for speaking about Srila Prabhupada's instructions today. Being his disappearance day, which I was just telling somebody last night, that although it's been 43 years, I still haven't been able to figure out how I'm supposed to be festive today. Madhavananda said something very nice that he had heard, and it's sort of, I've expressed it in different ways before, but it was very nice, encapsulated it very nicely that for us, when the spiritual master departs, it's a cause of pain and great suffering. But for those in the spiritual world, it's a festival. So that's, I thought that was a very nice meditation. And we've already been hearing expressions from Brihad Bhagavatamrita, especially for Krishna, how much of it is a festival for him when his devotee returns. But it's been a day that I've taken part in various events, observations of Srila Prabhupada's disappearance. And what can I say? It's not the same as Vyasa Puja, although Prabhupada has stated on himself in his books many times that appearance and disappearance, they are the same. And there's no doubt about it philosophically, as Prabhupada has given the example of the sun's appearance on the eastern horizon and its disappearance on the western horizon. It's not when the sun appears that the sun has been created, and when the sun disappears, it's no longer there. The sun is always there in the sky. And similarly for Krishna's ambassador, the devotee who comes to reclaim fallen souls, his appearance in this world is like the appearance of the sun, and his disappearance in the eastern sky, and his disappearance is like the sun leaving our vision in the western sky. But although our vision is, we can no longer see him, Srila Prabhupada did give instructions and left behind in his Vani how to see and associate and be with the spiritual master, even though he is not in our physical presence, and therefore how to see him in his instructions. So that has been a meditation. Many devotees have adopted. We definitely, I remember in 1977, when Prabhupada departed, it was a very, I would say, an obsessive meditation for survival. And at least for myself, but I'm sure I can speak for many other of my God brothers and God sisters. It was obsessive because it was the rope that Srila Prabhupada left behind for us to hold on to, and knowing that, as he himself gave in so many examples, that the spiritual master is like the person who throws the rope to the person who's drowning in the ocean. But if we expect to be pulled out of the ocean, it's our responsibility to hold tightly onto the rope. And therefore, when Prabhupada departed, that rope was something that was palpable. It was there for all of us, and Prabhupada's emphasis over and over again to his followers is that everything is in my books. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that today in my reflections on Srila Prabhupada's Disappearance Day. I'll speak about it. I'm going to speak by giving some references, but I will also say that the most of my references, which I will speak from today, will be from his books. And I'll explain the reason why. Although there are a couple of references I've given from his lectures, I'll do that in the beginning. And but for the most part, it will be from his purports in the Srimad Bhagavatam, because especially relevant are several purports that Srila Prabhupada gave us in his books as how the disciples should maintain his life in the physical absence of the spiritual master. Devotees know these references. We've read them again and again. We embraced them, certainly, when Prabhupada departed. And speaking for myself, I probably read them, I can't count how many times I've read them. But I wanted to read from them today and speak a little bit from them, but I'm going to let Srila Prabhupada do a substantial amount of talking today because that's his Vani. That's his Vani. And just as Prabhupada used his recorder and spoke and gave us his association, and through his ecstasies and his purports, and clearly that's his Vani. I remember my god sister, my mother Isha, she always used to tell me one of her services that she was doing is she was transcribing. She was very excellent typist. And one of her services was she would get the tapes that Prabhupada somehow arranged to his disciples to get to her. And there's one very famous picture of her with these big headphones on her head as she's very joyfully sitting in front of the typewriter and absorbed. And she, from time to time, would share with me, because Mother Isha, as many of you know, she's one of my Siksha gurus. She's definitely taught me one very, very important instruction. That is always, of course I can't follow it, but she taught it by her example. She would never say anything or speak anything that wasn't about Krishna. Just Just didn't come from her mouth. And I accept that as a very, very important instruction, an example to follow. So many things that she told me and shared with me when she would sometimes come on Sundays, and she would come up to my office when I was the temple president. She told me once, I told her about that picture, and she told me how much she relished that service of listening to Prabhupada. And that was her ecstasy. Prabhupada had his ecstasies in the form of his purports, and Mother Isha's ecstasy was listening to Prabhupada's purports so that she could type them out and give them to the BBT. So that's how Prabhupada gave his association to us, and he emphasized it, that these books were beneficial for everyone, for us, especially his disciples and followers, and for generations to come. And so I will be reading from some of Srila Prabhupada's purports. And the reason why a lot of emphasis will be on Vani, I'd like to begin with one very famous verse and purport. It's in the 4th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where I'm going to be reading from this whole story, so I won't explain it right now. It's about King Puranjana and how King Puranjana, how he had to, it's an allegorical story, which Narada Muni gave to King Prachinabarhishat because of his attachment to fruitive activities. He instructed King Prachinabarhishat by using an allegorical story in which King Prachinabarhishat was Puranjana, the person that he used in the allegory, and how Puranjana gave up his body. Puranjana is actually the living entity, and how Puranjana had gave up his body, being very much absorbed and attached to his wife, to his family, and because of his attachment to his wife, he had to take birth in his next life as the daughter of King Malayadvaja, and the wife of King Malayadvaja, the daughter of King Vaidarbha. Her name was Vaidarbi, and we'll get to that part. But in the one of the verses, Prabhupada explains about Vaidarbi. He says that being now alone and a widow in that forest, the daughter of Vidarbha began to lament, incessantly shedding tears, which soaked her breasts, and crying very loudly. Purport. Prabhupada says, I should probably begin with Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada says, figuratively, the queen is supposed to be the disciple of the king. Thus, when the mortal body of the spiritual master expires, his disciples should cry exactly as the queen cries when the king leaves his body. However, the disciple and spiritual master are never separated, because the spiritual master always keeps company with the disciple as long as the disciple follows strictly the instructions of the spiritual master. This is called the association of Vani, words. Physical presence is called Vapu. As long as the spiritual master is physically present, the disciple should serve the physical body of the spiritual master. And when the spiritual master is no longer physically existing, as long as the spiritual master is physically present, the disciple should serve the physical body of the spiritual master. And when the spiritual master is no longer physically existing, the disciple should serve the instructions of the spiritual master. This is one of many purports in this particular section of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where Srila Prabhupada speaks about Vani and the importance of his instructions. There are many instructions Srila Prabhupada left behind. But as I explained, I wish to look for solace primarily from those which he left in his books. And Prabhupada always emphasized just how much his books, above everything else, were important to him, were important to us, and were important to future generations of devotees. But I will say that I've been listening, as many devotees know, I've been listening to Prabhupada's lectures at least 1 to 2 hours every day for the last 8 months. And so obviously, as much as his books are so important, and I'll even going to read a reference today where Prabhupada specifically says, my books are more important than my lectures. And the explanation will be there also when I read it. Certainly, his lectures are something that cannot be dismissed as irrelevant and not important. They are a source of nourishment. They are a source of life. They are a source of, for me, a daily meditation. And especially, I've been listening to lectures. The last series of lectures were Prabhupada's lectures in 1976 in Vrindavan. And I cannot go back and remember a lecture, not one, in all of these lectures he's been giving, I've been listening to, where Prabhupada was not emphatic and stating several times in the lecture how the material world is a place of suffering, how we do not belong in the material world. And again, he's like, it's like a sledgehammer. And sometimes devotees say, okay, we know this. We know this. We've heard it before. Sometimes even devotees, I hear devotees sometimes say, we need something deeper. And when I hear this sometimes, all I know is when Prabhupada speaks it, it's deep. Because Prabhupada spoke it with such realization. And because he spoke it with such realization, it's very deep and very relevant. And that's why I read TKG's diary today for hours. Because in TKG's diary, I read different sections, but I was reading this section about Prabhupada's visit to England, physical pain, inconveniences and what may appear externally to be like suffering, and which was being recorded by Prabhupada's personal secretary, who was with him practically every moment of the day since February of 1977, and recorded every day Prabhupada's facial expressions, his instructions, his detachment, his confidence, his happiness, his tears. One of the things that Tamal Krishna Maharaj recorded in his diary, I can't remember how many times I read it today, how Prabhupada broke down crying in tears, being with his disciples. And who can understand what was going on in Prabhupada's mind? I'm not going to project. Tamal Krishna Maharaj didn't project in his diary. He just simply gave us the visual facts that he was observing. But so many times, Prabhupada would break down in tears, especially being with his disciples and expressing his happiness to be under their care, his sometimes submissiveness, sometimes challenging, sometimes difficult, but always detached. Always. And it was that detachment that rings so clearly, not only in TKG's diary, but I've listened to Conversations, 1977 Conversations of Prabhupada. I've listened to all of them from January to November, at least twice. If you want to understand the depth of Prabhupada's realizations, listen to Prabhupada's mostly Conversations in 1977. Prabhupada was speaking with such depth of realization because he was detached. Detached, and of course, as so perfectly illustrated in Yadubar's video, 3 days prior to his departure, his crystal consciousness and clarity on Krishna's pastimes, as he was giving us his ecstasies in the 10th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, reciting them as Jayadvaita Maharaj was holding the microphone to his lips, and Prabhupada was speaking with such clarity, which he never lost. He never lost. Although it was painful, he did experience pain. He had to go in for an emergency surgery. Sometimes devotees had to move him in different ways in order to relieve the pain he was going through. But his sense of detachment, which was so present and observed by those who were with him, I believe when I hear Prabhupada again and again hammering these points, he was hammering it for a reason. And I'll bring up that reason also because this was the class, it just so happens, this was the class I was listening to yesterday. I wasn't listening to it because I picked it for today. It was yesterday's class. What can I say? It was yesterday's class. And yesterday's class, when I was meditating on what to speak about today, was it was another one of Prabhupada's, again, repetition of It is the duty of the disciple, to understand that this material world is not a place for trying to become happy. It is the duty of the disciple to understand that his objective is to go back home, back to Godhead. And I'm going to read the verse from the 5th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam that Prabhupada was speaking from in yesterday's class. And I believe it will help us to understand why Prabhupada felt the need to hammer certain points. It's a verse from the 5th canto, and it's Lord Rishabhdeva's instructions to his sons. 5th canto, 5th chapter. It's 15th verse. I'm not going to read the purport, I'm only going to read the verse. And then what I'm going to also read is just a very short excerpt from what I heard yesterday in Prabhupada's lecture. So the verse: if one is serious about going back home, back to Godhead, he must consider the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the summum bonum and chief aim of life. If he is a father instructing his sons, a spiritual master instructing his disciples, or a king instructing his citizens, he must instruct them as I have advised, without being angry. He should continue giving instructions, even if his disciple, son, or citizen is sometimes unable to follow his order. Ignorant people who engage in pious and impious activities should be engaged in devotional service by all means. They should always avoid fruitive activity. If one puts into the bondage of karmic activity his disciple, son, or citizen who is bereft of transcendental vision, how will one profit? It is like leading a blind man to a dark well and causing him to fall in. It's a verse. Lord Rishabhdeva speaking to his son. Prabhupada translated it. Without being angry, he should continue giving instructions even if his disciple is sometimes unable to follow his order. How many times, we can only guess, how many times did Prabhupada observe his disciple unable to follow his order? How many times did Prabhupada observe his disciples deviating in some way? And yet Prabhupada, being the compassionate father, spiritual master, would never give up. Never gave up. In his manifest presence, he never gave up. Even to the point of shedding tears and crying out of affection for his disciples, wanting to give them everything he could possibly give them. He never gave up, instructing his words and by his example. Prabhupada said, I want to be like Arjuna, to die on the battlefield, fighting to the last breath. And that's what Prabhupada did. He was showing us an example and always caring and instructing in so many different ways so that those instructions will somehow be impregnated in the heart, and that those instructions impregnated in the heart could continue to be watered by reading his books. That's what Prabhupada's faith was. And therefore he made so many statements to the effect of the importance, everything I've given in my books. Everything. And yet, with all that said, I'm going to read a short section of Prabhupada's lecture. Just a short section of his lecture that I heard yesterday to this verse. And Prabhupada said, each body is for a short period. It will not last forever. But so long it will last, it will be cause of suffering that we do not understand. This is the ignorance, mudha. And this suffering can be ended only by surrendering to Krishna. Mam evaye prapadyante, mayam etam tarantite. The suffering is inflicted by Maya. Bhunkte prakritijan gunan. But there is no education. People are so dull, rascal. They cannot understand that they are suffering, and the suffering they are accepting as enjoyment. In this way, they are rotting in this material world. Lecture in Vrindavan, 1976. Vrindavan, Krishna Balaram Mandir. The whole purpose is therefore how to get out of this suffering. Vindate tapan mudha. So the aim of life is how to stop this suffering. The guru or the government should rule over the dependents with this point, with this aim in view. Matloka kamo mad anugraharta. These two things required. How to get the pleasure or the mercy of the Supreme Lord, and how to go back home, back to Godhead. This is the aim. Not that we are making plan to be happy. Unless we go back home, back to Godhead, there's no question of peace or happiness. This place, we are trying to be happy within this material world by material adjustment. That is not possible. Dukkhalayam ashashvatam. This was yesterday's lecture. Prabhupada was speaking. 2 points. 2 points. He said right here, 2 things required. Pleasure of the Supreme Lord, pleasure and mercy of the Supreme Lord, and how to get the pleasure and mercy of the Supreme Lord, and how to go back home, back to Godhead. These are the 2 things required. Again and again, Prabhupada, in these lectures that I've been listening to, just hammering these points relentlessly of how this material world is a place of suffering. I could give so many references from lectures, but as I said, I want to try to stick to the books. And I'll give one reference in an explanation as to why I want to stick with the books. And this reference is a letter it was written in 1977. I discovered it many, many years ago and shared it with many devotees after I discovered it. And I remember I discovered it when I was speaking to some devotees at a book distribution festival. And I was looking for some quotes about the importance of Prabhupada's books. And I discovered it then. And it was a letter that it was written in 1977, July. As I just said, Tamal Krishna Maharaj was always with Prabhupada in 1977. He became his secretary, I believe it was either February or March, and was with him constantly until the time he departed. And he would discuss many things with Prabhupada. He would read his mail. Other devotees were there present also. But at this particular point in time, Prabhupada had entrusted him to write letters. And Prabhupada would answer them. In some cases, he would answer them. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj wrote them. This is a letter that was written on July 20th, 1977. And it was to a devotee who I actually know very well. I was very close with him in New York in the late 70s, but I won't mention his name. But it was a letter to him, and this devotee had written to Prabhupada requesting him to please be allowed to summarize Prabhupada's recorded lectures. No, at least, excuse me, to transcribe them, I think. To transcribe them, not to summarize them. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj says, in discussing with His Divine Grace, I summarize your desire to have access to all of the many tapes which Golden Avatar has for the purpose of transcribing them into rough manuscript form to be published later on as cross-references or in some other form. His Divine Grace was not very enthusiastic at all about this idea. Srila Prabhupada commented, quote, "This is not necessary. My books are sufficient. Let all my disciples read my books. This idea is overburdened. It will mean too many readings. Let them read whatever is there and digest it. Everything I have wanted to say, I have said in my books. This will only be superfluous. Tell him to concentrate on reading my books, not on studying such transcriptions. Does he think he will find something else in these transcriptions that are not in my books?" 1977, July. And then he ends the letter by saying, actually, you should know that Prabhupada's books are better than his speeches. This is because he concentrates tremendously and chooses each word when he writes these books. This is not my opinion, but he himself has said this to me. So, just reading. Again, how important Prabhupada, what he put into his books for his followers, how important it was to him, how important when in 1977, when devotees were coming and giving reports, Prabhupada would say what gave him life was hearing about the publication of his books in different languages. He emphasized this again and again to us in the 70s when he would speak to his disciples and in the classes, and again emphasize, I've put everything in my books. Everything is there simply by associating with me in these books. You'll find everything. And there's more that could be said, but I'm just using this as the reason why I wanted to use most of the references today about how the disciple should maintain his life in the absence of the spiritual master, from what Srila Prabhupada specifically wrote in his books. Because he definitely wrote about this in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Definitely wrote about it in the 4th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam in the purports. don't disturb me with questions, please. I wish I could turn it off so I don't see them, but I don't know how to do it. Otherwise, I'll have to stop looking at the screen. So, as I said, in the fourth canto, in the story of King Puranjana, as we said, it's an allegorical story, and Puranjana is the living entity who becomes very much attached to the body, becomes very much attached to his kingdom, becomes very much attached to his wife, and describes how much he was thinking of his wife, of all the service she selflessly rendered to him, and he was meditating on his wife, and then with being attached in this way, and then because of his absorption and thinking of his attachments, including his wife, he had to take birth again in his next life, in the form of a woman who was known as Vaidarbhi, who was the son of King Vaidarbha. And King Vaidarbha, gave Vaidarbhi in marriage to another king whose name was Malayadvaja. Now, Malayadvaja was a king also, but Malayadvaja, he cultivated detachment. And he is described as a king who detached himself from his kingdom before the time came for him to give up his body. He detached himself from his kingdom. He turned over his kingdom to his different sons. He absorbed himself in thoughts of the Supreme Lord. And his wife, Vaidarbhi, who was Puranjana, his wife, Vaidarbhi, was very faithfully serving him, even in his state, in his meditative state, an absorbed state, meditating on the Supreme Lord, specifically on the presence of the Lord within his heart, is the super soul. And at the appropriate time, it's described how Vaidarbhi, who again, as we said, was King Puranjana, who had taken his birth in his next life as Vaidarbhi, the queen of Malayadvaja. She was rendering all kinds of service. And in this verse, it's described that the daughter of King Vaidarbha continued as usual to serve her husband, who was seated in a steady posture until she could ascertain that he had passed away from the body. And Prabhupada says in the purport, it appears that the queen did not even talk to her husband while serving. She would simply perform her prescribed duties without talk. Thus, she did not stop rendering service until she could ascertain that her husband had passed from the body. And then the next verse says, while she was serving her husband, by massaging his legs, she could feel that his feet were no longer warm and can thus understand that he had already passed from the body. She felt great anxiety on being left alone. Bereft of her husband's company, she felt exactly as a deer feels upon being separated from its mate. And then the next verse is the verse we read at the very beginning. Being now alone and a widow in that forest, the daughter of Vidarbha began to lament incessantly, shedding tears which soaked her breasts, crying very loudly. And Prabhupada explains that the disciple cries when the spiritual master leaves. You can talk to anybody. As I've said many times, when they found out Prabhupada departed, there's probably not one devotee who doesn't remember where they were, what they were doing. It was like the earth stood still. It was devastating. I know exactly where I was. I know exactly who I was with. I know exactly who told me. And obviously, it's just as Vaidarbhi had given herself in service to her husband. Prabhupada uses this as an example that it is like disciple giving his life in service to the spiritual master, giving his heart, his life, everything. So when the spiritual master leaves, naturally, the disciple cries. And on such occasions as Srila Prabhupada's Disappearance Day, sometimes it may even happen, but it's as we said, it's been difficult to observe it as a festival, a joyous festival. Maybe the residents elsewhere are celebrating, but we still feel the separation. And there's something to be had in feelings of separation, as I spoke about recently. We gave the example of Raghunath Das Goswami and the separation he felt when Swarup Damodar, who Lord Chaitanya had personally entrusted to him, when he left this world, then the separation he felt when Giridhar Pandit left this world, and then he decided he was going to go to Vrindavan. He was feeling so much separation from the Lord and his associates. Then he was thinking that how can I go on living? And then, of course, who was the first person that he meets in Vrindavan? He meets Sanatana Goswami, and Sanatana Goswami tells Raghunath Das Goswami, no, don't think about this. I already went through this before with Lord Chaitanya. I was also thinking how I couldn't leave anymore. And he told me how to live, told me how to stay in this world. He gave me instructions, and he said that you've given this body to me. How can you think of giving it up? Because it's even said in these verses that, and we'll read it, how the disciple thinks that if he can't follow the instructions of the spiritual master, then he should give up the body. This is also right there in this story of Queen Vaidarbhi and her husband, Malayadhvaj. It's in one purport, it's coming up. But of course, as we know, Prabhupada was very compassionate. As we said, he instructed again and again and again, even if the disciples cannot follow, he was always there. I always remember one story, although I've heard it, different versions of the story. I've heard one story when one young devotee asked Prabhupada, Prabhupada, if we don't make it back to Godhead in this life, you'll come back and get us? And I was told Prabhupada's answer was, yes, but don't take advantage of it. Don't make your spiritual master come back. There's another reference. Prabhupada was once asked this question about how the spiritual master is described, that he's a spiritual master of disciple, birth after birth. Does this mean you'll come back, Prabhupada? And this devotee also said that Prabhupada, in this particular conversation, he slammed his hand against the table. He said, no, this life, yes, I will come back, but this life you should go back to Godhead. So, Prabhupada was very merciful, very, very merciful. Even if we couldn't follow his instructions, he was always careful, kind, and very, very personal. So many stories of even some of his disciples, when they would leave, Prabhupada was crying for them. I know because one of his disciples who had left, he happened to be my GBC at the time, and I remember when he left. And Prabhupada was crying, and he was so disturbed because devotees were speaking about the circumstances under which he left. And Prabhupada became so angry. You're making it impossible for him to come back by speaking these things about him. Prabhupada considered his disciples so dear to him because they gave their lives to him. And he was always grateful. Always grateful for whatever service they rendered. He said, and we read in the letter the other day, he said, they're given everything. They're better than kings. And Prabhupada would often say that. He would say that to people who would come to him and speak to him about his disciples. And Prabhupada would very, very strongly said, they've given their lives to me. And how grateful he would be expressing these feelings towards them. And that's why he would cry. He would cry. He had pain. And when he saw that his disciples were not following strictly, he felt pain. But he was always there to encourage them and to help them. So when a disciple gives their life to such a glorious master, obviously we cry. And we feel separation. And to feel separation, just as we were describing, Sanatana Goswami was speaking to Raghunath Das Goswami, saying, you've given your life to me. Lord Chaitanya told him, you've given your life to me. And you can't give me something and then take it away. And then he said that if I thought I could achieve perfection and go back to Godhead by giving up my life, I'd give up my body millions of times. But he said, no, I have plans for that body. So Sanatana Goswami told this to Raghunath Das Goswami. Raghunath Das Goswami then went to Govardhan and rendered confidential service to the Lord, meditated on the instructions of the Lord, meditated on the move and service of Lord Chaitanya, and then Sanatana Goswami left. What pain of separation. And then Rupa Goswami. Rupa Goswami was his life, his very life. Although he received many instructions from Sanatana Goswami, Rupa Goswami taught him everything about the confidential service. And then Rupa Goswami left. So you can imagine the feelings of separation and pain the disciple feels from the loss of the spiritual master. Such separation, of course, should be felt by the disciples, and this becomes our festival, so to speak, by remembering his instructions and by crying. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid this. But by crying. The Lord of our heart. It's painful. But it's purifying to remember it. Then, reading these verses, Vaidarbi is saying, "O best of kings, please get up, get up. Just see this world surrounded by water and infested with rogues and so-called kings. This world is very much afraid, and it is your duty to protect her." Then Prabhupada gives a purport explaining, I won't read the whole purport, but the essence of it is that when the Acharya is the authorized representative of the Lord, establishes principles, how to go back to Godhead, and when he disappears, how to become Krishna conscious. When he disappears, things once again become disordered. Therefore, the perfect disciples of the Acharya try to relieve the situation by sincerely following the instructions of the spiritual master. That's the essence of that purport there. Text 49. That most obedient wife thus fell down at the feet of her dead husband and began to cry pitifully in that solitary forest. Thus, the tears rolled down from her eyes. Purport. Just as a devoted wife becomes afflicted at the passing away of her husband, when the spiritual master passes away, disciple becomes similarly bereaved. Text 50. She then prepared a blazing fire with firewood and placed the dead body of her husband upon it. When this was finished, she lamented severely and prepared herself to perish in the fire with her husband. I'll just read the purport, part of the purport. And this is what I referred to. This indicates that a devotee's wife must be prepared to act in such a way. Similarly, a devoted disciple of the spiritual master would rather die with the spiritual master than fail to execute the spiritual master's mission. As the Supreme Personality of Godhead comes down upon this earth to reestablish the principles of religion, so his representative, the spiritual master, also comes to reestablish religious principles. It is the duty of the disciples to take charge of the mission of the spiritual master and execute it properly. Otherwise, the disciple should decide to die along with the spiritual master. In other words, to execute the will of the spiritual master, the disciple should be prepared to lay down his life and abandon all personal considerations. That is that purport. There's more. I'm going to read just a few more verses. Text 51. My dear king, one Brahmin who was an old friend of King Paranjana came to that place and began to pacify the queen with sweet words. Now, who is this Brahmin? This Brahmin, Prabhupada explained, is an old friend. Who is the old friend? Super soul. Super soul appears before Vaidarbi, and I'll read the purport. The appearance of an old friend in the form of a Brahmin is very significant. In his Paramatma feature, Krishna is the old friend of everyone. According to the Shruti mantra, according to Vedic injunction, Krishna is sitting with the living entity side by side. According to the Shruti mantra, Dva Suparna Sayuja Sakaya, the Lord is sitting within the heart of every living entity as Suhrit, the best friend. The Lord is always eager to have the living entity come home back to Godhead. We've been reading about this. This is the whole fourth chapter of Brihad Bhagavatamrita that we've been reading. So many verses of how the Lord expressed his enthusiasm, eagerness, and intense desire for Gopakumar to turn his face to him, which was an expression of the intense desire of the Lord in the heart, wanting the old friend. Why is he an old friend? Prabhupada explains why he's an old friend. Because he's been with us since time immemorial. He's been observing, waiting, just waiting. And Prabhupada explains this later in the purport. But that's why he's described as an old friend of King Puranjana. Right? Now it's an old friend of King Puranjana. Why? Because it's Vaidarbhi, but Vaidarbhi was formerly King Puranjana, and now the verse is describing an old friend of King Puranjana. It's the same old friend now coming back to him as Vaidarbhi. But of course, as Puranjana, he paid no attention to him at all. But now as Vaidarbhi, the old friend is coming in the form of this Brahmin. And Prabhupada is going to explain what this Brahmin is going to say to Vaidarbhi, who's lamenting that my husband is gone, or as the disciple is thinking, my spiritual master is gone. My spiritual master, the Lord of my life, he's gone. How will I live? How will I continue? How will I be able to go on? So Prabhupada says the appearance of an old friend in the form of a Brahmin is very significant. In his Paramatma feature, Krishna is the old friend of everyone. According to Vedic injunction, Krishna is sitting within the living entity side by side. According to the Shruti mantra, Dva Suparna Sayuja Sakaya, the Lord is sitting within the heart of every living entity as Suhrit, the best friend. The Lord is always eager to have the living entity come home back to Godhead. Sitting with the living entity as witness, the Lord gives him all chances to enjoy himself materially. But whenever there is an opportunity, the Lord gives good counsel and advises the living entity to abandon trying to become happy through material adjustment and instead turn his face toward the Supreme Personality of Godhead and surrender to him. When one becomes serious to follow the mission of the spiritual master, his resolution is tantamount to seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As explained before, this means meeting the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the instruction of the spiritual master. This is technically called Vani Seva. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur states in his Bhagavad Gita commentary on the verse, Vyavasayatmaka Buddhir Ekeha Kuru Nandana, that one should serve the words of the spiritual master The disciple must stick to whatever the spiritual master orders. Simply by following on that line, one sees the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Paramatma, appeared before the queen as a Brahmin. But why didn't he appear in his original form as Sri Krishna? Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur remarks that unless one is very highly elevated, loving the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one cannot see him as he is. Nonetheless, if one sticks to the principles enunciated by the spiritual master, somehow or other, he is in association with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Since the Lord is in the heart, he can advise a sincere disciple from within. This is also confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pitipurvakam tadami buddhiyogam tam yena mam upayanti te. To those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. There's more in the purport. In fact, there's that famous quote where Prabhupada says that instead of trying to see Krishna behind some bush in Vrindavan, one should try to see Krishna in the words of the spiritual master. This is how to see the spirit. This is how to see Krishna face to face. So, of course, there's a certain criteria Prabhupada is given in the purport, but he did say very clearly that in the example of King Paranjana, after his spiritual master, or Vaidarbhi, after his spiritual master left, or the king Malayadvaja left, the disciple gets help from an old friend. He's ready to help. That old friend is there, ready to help. What does Prabhupada say? How to get that help from the old friend is to stick to the Vani Seva, to stick to the instructions which the spiritual master has left behind for his disciples, to remember those instructions, to act on them. Of course, Prabhupada says, also including in this is serving his mission. We understand also, if you ask many devotees, I'm sure they'll tell you that many times they've questioned the kind of difficulties and obstacles that they need to confront in the execution of serving the mission. But it's service. It's service. But even beyond that, Prabhupada said in this verse that we heard yesterday, Prabhupada said two very important points. What were those two important points? Two important points was to please the Supreme Lord, how to please the Supreme Lord, and how to obtain the mercy of the Supreme Lord, and how to go back home, back to Godhead. This is how a disciple lives his life. We know in our efforts to please the Supreme Lord, we hold on to these instructions. Many devotees will testify, how can they know how to please the Supreme Lord? And Prabhupada himself has clearly stated that in the instructions of the spiritual master is the best way to please the Supreme Lord. But what happens when the spiritual master departs? Then the Lord, in the heart of the disciple, is like an old friend. He's waiting to help those who are sincere and who are always endeavoring to remember those instructions, and who always understand that the goal is to go back home, back to Godhead. Someone may say, well, the goal is to please the Supreme Lord. Prabhupada even said this in one place. The goal is to love Krishna. But loving Krishna means back to Godhead. There's no difference. Loving Krishna, back to Godhead. In fact, no, I'm not going to read it. It's from a lecture. I want to stick and end with what Srila Prabhupada said in his books. And there's one more verse I'll read and then we'll end. This verse 52. The Brahmin inquired as follows: Who are you? Whose wife or daughter are you? Who is the man lying here? It appears you are lamenting for this dead body. Don't you recognize me? I'm your eternal friend. You may remember that many times in the past, you have consulted me. So, Prabhupada then speaks about in the purport, about renunciation. One is sincere and pure, gets an opportunity to consult with the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his Paramatma feature, sitting within everyone's heart. Paramatma is always the Checha Guru, the spiritual master within, and he comes before one externally as the instructor and the initiator spiritual master. The Lord can reside within the heart, and he can also come out before a person and give him instructions. Thus, the spiritual master is not different from the supersoul sitting within the heart. An uncontaminated soul or living entity can get a chance to meet the Paramatma face to face, just as one gets a chance to consult with the Paramatma within his heart. One also gets a chance to see him actually situated before him. Then one can take instructions from the supersoul directly. This is the duty of the pure devotee, to see the bona fide spiritual master and consult with the supersoul within the heart. Of course, Prabhupada already explained before in one of the purports that we just read that to consult with supersoul, to see the supersoul, to follow his instructions is an advanced state of consciousness. There's a very, very well-known discussion. I think it was in 1976 in New Vrindavan when Prabhupada severely chastised one devotee, severely, who was claiming that he was being asked questions by students and teachers in the universities. What is the need of the spiritual master? Why can't we just take instruction from God directly? And although the disciple was innocently, simply, very innocently presenting to something that he had heard from people in the colleges, universities where he was preaching, Prabhupada took advantage to literally just smash him. And he asked the disciple, did you tell him? Did you give him the answer? Why didn't you give him the answer? And then he said, I know why you didn't give them the answer. And he said, because you're not reading my books. That's why you didn't give them the answer. If you would read my books, you would have all the answers you need. You didn't give him the answer. Otherwise, why would you ask such a foolish question? Who does the Lord speak to? The Lord doesn't speak to just anybody. He speaks to somebody. Don't you know what Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita? Tesham satatam yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam dadami buddhi yogam tam yena mamupayanti te. He speaks to those who are always meditating on how to serve him, how to know how to serve him without accepting spiritual master. How can they speak to the Lord? Didn't you defeat them? You're not reading my books. And Prabhupada and the devotee was just, if you read, but Prabhupada, and then he finally asked the question that, Prabhupada, how does one become humble in the presence? Because he was just so devastated. He was just so completely devastated. And then Prabhupada then turned to another devotee who was present there, I can't remember, and he said, answer his question. So certainly, it's not that one can really ascend and to meditate and to think, yes, now I have super soul. But Prabhupada makes it very clear that who the super soul, who that old friend is, he'll come and that old friend will come and will help and help that devotee who sincerely remains fixed on serving the instructions of his spiritual master, meditating on his instructions, and praying for help. Then help is there. Prabhupada said, help is there for those who are sincere and for those who are pure in motive. How to become pure in motive? Our only hope to become pure in motive is to become motivated to please those who are pure. There's no other hope. That is our meditation on Srila Prabhupada's Disappearance Day. And I've taken it from Prabhupada himself, who's given everything to us in his books as to how the disciple should live when the spiritual master departs, how he should maintain his life and go on serving. This is not only was instructed by Srila Prabhupada, but as we said in the pastimes of Srila Prabhupada, he taught perfectly, not only as the ideal spiritual master, but as the ideal disciple. He taught everything. How to give one's life to the order of Guru. Vyavasayatmaka buddhi eke hakuru. Nandana Prabhupada would quote this verse again and again. Why would he quote this verse? He's quoting Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's explanation of this verse, that resolute in purpose means to be fixed on trying to execute. As incapable as we are, as helpless as we are, as unqualified as we are, as fallen as we are, but somehow or other, it's the rope. It's the rope that will help us to someday achieve Prabhupada's pleasure and to actually accomplish these 2 points that Srila Prabhupada said in his lecture yesterday. How to please the Lord and get his mercy, how to go back home, back to Godhead. So I will stop here. I said I was only going to speak for an hour, but I spoke a little bit longer. And thank you for attending. This is not a japa session, so I'm not going to continue with chanting japa. As a matter of fact, I told devotees locally that we're going to continue and have a pushpanjali and an artik, and I can't remember what else we're going to be doing. But we'll try to meditate on Srila Prabhupada. And it's supposed to begin in 5 minutes. I think it may be online. I'm going to try to put it online, and we'll see what happens. And thank you very much. I'll end here. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Panchakalpa turubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha.